Hi, it's me, and welcome to this overview and guide on how to use the N-Corp, Nagel, and Hammer identities in Limbus Company. N-Corp's Nagel and Hammer is the largest faction of IDs that are currently available, with half of the Sinners having an ID from the faction. It's important to note, however, that these are all Season 1 IDs, meaning that, depending on when you're watching this, they may not be available in the dispensary. You can still pull them from any banner at any time, however. The IDs included within this faction are N-Corp Kleinhammer Heathcliff, N-Corp Mittelhammer Rhodia, N-Corp Mittelhammer Don Quixote, N-Corp Grotzhammer Mersault, the one who grips Faust, and the one who shall grip Sinclair. Of these, the strongest three would be Heathcliff, Faust, and Sinclair, but all of them have their uses depending on your team. These IDs have two entire status effects that only they are capable of gaining or inflicting, being Nails and Fanatic. Nails is the far more important of the two. At the start of the turn, any character who has Nails will be inflicted with 1 bleed as well as bleed count equal to the number of Nails, then the amount of Nails on them will be reduced by 50% rounded down. This is one of the most reliable ways to inflict bleed count in the game, so these IDs automatically have synergy with bleed teams. Fanatic is the less important effect, increasing your skill power by the amount of Fanatic you have when attacking an enemy who has Nails, then disappearing at the end of the turn. Usually, Fanatic is also used to trigger effects on certain skills, so it's important to note what skills benefit from it. Not every member of this faction is able to gain Fanatic by themselves, and so some may need to gain it through an ally's passive. Now that the basics are out of the way, let's go over each ID individually and assess their strengths and weaknesses. Starting off with the most wrongfully underrated ID in the game, we have N-Corp Kleinhammer Heathcliff. Starting with his first skill, it's actually one of the better skill ones that this game has to offer, hitting twice with a decent roll range as well as being able to inflict Nails. The majority of the N-Corp identities have some variation of this skill 1, with this being the second strongest variant of it. His second skill is a 1-coin skill that rolls 6 to 14, which, while not being the best roll range ever, has pretty high consistency in clashes while at high sanity. It also gives Heathcliff a small amount of SP on winning a clash, and gaining SP from skills is a rare effect to see on any character except Hong Lu. It's also the only non-ego skill capable of inflicting plus coin drop, which reduces the bonus of positive coins by 1 per stack. This effect is, by itself, strong enough to make this Heathcliff one of the best 2-star IDs to bring into the hard mode mirror dungeon, as it helps deal with the insane roll ranges of enemies, which is commendable by itself. Lastly, we have Infirm Retribution, which isn't a very noteworthy skill other than the fact that it deals a lot of damage. The unfortunate thing about N-Heath is that he has the least amount of synergy with the other N-Corp IDs while being active in battle, but in any other team setup, he's a lot stronger. He also has one of the best combination of sin affinities, being Envy, Gloom, Lust, which is perfect for fueling Faust's Fluid Sac, which is arguably the strongest ego in the game. His combat passive is the reason he was overlooked by me at first. Effects that activate when allies are killed are never useful, and the fact that it costs him 10 SP while only giving him a single blunt power-up, which doesn't even benefit all of his skills, makes it one of the weakest passives in the game, to the point of it being more harmful than helpful. His support passive is a lot more useful, allowing teams with N-Corp IDs to more consistently inflict Nails. This is helpful because there are several skills that activate if the target has a certain amount of Nails, so overall a very good support passive. This ID also perfectly fuels 2 of Heathcliff's ego, the first of which is Body Sac, which has always been one of the strongest base ego, dealing decent damage while giving Heathcliff a power boost on hit as well as whenever an enemy is killed from that point forward. The other fueled ego, AEDD, has a higher roll than Body Sac, but otherwise doesn't help this ID very much. It does give him haste, though less than Body Sac, but the charge he gains isn't helpful, and you probably won't gain much if you're doing well. The main reason you would use this is because N-Corp Heathcliff is actually fast enough to allow enemies to take advantage of the paralysis and gloom fragility it inflicts, but honestly, Body Sac is usually going to be more useful in this case. Whew, that was quite a lot to say about the first ID, huh? Anyways, on to N-Corp Mittelhammer Rhodia, whose main problem lies in the fact that her clash power isn't particularly good. She does make up for it in damage potential in my opinion, and she does have some ways of gaining power on her own to close the gap. Her first skill is the same template for N-Corp, except that it doesn't inflict Nails. Of the N-Corp IDs, Rhodia is the best one at inflicting bleed potency, which is reflected in this skill to a degree. Her second skill is the only skill she has which inflicts nails and does so for next turn, which makes it a bit slower in that regard, but it also can inflict next turn paralysis, which is always good. It also gives her Fanatic on Clash Win. As stated before, some N-Corp IDs aren't able to gain Fanatic on their own, so this is noteworthy by itself. Lastly, Ironclad Retribution is one of the hardest hitting blunt skills in the game while she has Fanatic, mostly because it has 4 coins on it. While the bleed infliction of the last 2 coins is nice, usually this skill is going to be used for damage, especially since it doesn't roll particularly well. One of the main reasons Rhodia's damage potential is so high is because of her passive, which gives her 1 haste and damage up next turn, once per turn, if an ally is killed. On top of that, it also gives her Fanatic if she landed the killing blow, making her one of the only N-Corp IDs that can consistently have more than 1 Fanatic without the help of another ID. Her support passive does this for whichever ally has the most SP, but can't activate more than once per turn and isn't able to give Fanatic to anybody. And since it's a Wrath passive, you have to choose between that and plus 20% damage on Hex coins from her base support, so she isn't really helpful if not brought into the fight directly. N-Corp Mittelhammer Don Quixote is the only ID in the bunch that is an outlier in terms of their rolls. She can inflict nails just like the others, but the rest of her main purpose is to inflict Tremor, which no other N-Corp ID has any synergy with. Her first skill is the template skill again, but is significant for being Lust, which helps to activate her passives more often. Her second skill has a range of 4 to 16, which is not bad at winning clashes at high sanity. It also bursts Tremor and deals increased damage if the target has 5+ nails, making it the first example of a skill that has a bonus effect when the target has enough nails. In fact, Don has the only N-Corp ID with 2 effects that require the target to have 5 nails to activate. Fanatical Judgment's third coin inflicts attack power down and paralysis next turn if the target has 5+ nails, making it one of the better nails activated skills. It also inflicts some nails itself and has Tremor count infliction. If its roll range was a little bit better, it would be worth bringing Dawn into general team setups if you have her. The real use behind Dawn is found in her passives. While in battle, she can inflict Tremor count just by hitting enemies who have nails, and can even inflict nails if she has Fanatic. It's worth noting, however, that she has nothing to gain Fanatic by herself, so you'll be relying on her teammates to gain that. Her support passive doesn't seem very noteworthy at first, granting 10% damage to the ally with Fanatic who has the least SP, but there's merit in using it as a support thanks to the One Who Shall Grip Sinclair existing. While this ID is a bit disjointed in functionality, it's worth noting that it feels her lifetime stew very well thanks to her first skill being Lust. Since you're likely running any N-Corp IDs in a Lust setup, this ego can deal massive single target damage in both its awakened and corroded states due to their before attack effect. It also helps to convert your less useful resources into Lust for better damage, but it can also sometimes convert Sin resources you would want, so it might be good to save it for when it's necessary. Now moving on to our 3-star IDs, we have N-Corp Grotzhammer Mersalt, who is probably the weakest ID of the bunch. This is because he was designed to be defensive rather than offensive, and his skills reflect that. He's tied for the highest HP of any ID in the game with K-Corp Class 3 Honglu, and is one of the only tank IDs that can actually do a decent job tanking thanks to his counter skill giving him protection, reducing his damage taken. To start with, his passives are usually not helpful since they can only activate if there's an ally who's below 50% HP. Being able to give attack power up and Fanatic to other units or himself would be really helpful if not for requiring a low HP ally. As it stands, this passive will usually only activate on support teams that have She Association Ishmael on them, since that's the only ID that you would want to keep at low HP. His first skill, Drive, is not a template skill, and is notable for being able to lower his own stagger threshold. When he actually manages to hit this attack a few times, it makes him pretty difficult to stagger, but the attack only rolls 5 to 7, which is obnoxiously bad, so it can't be used for clashing in most circumstances, which makes it lose points. His second skill is better, inflicting a large amount of nails, as well as some bind, and even more bind as well as attack power down if the target has 5+ nails. It's a really useful skill for speed control, but will still lose clashes due to having a highest power of only 12, and his offense level isn't high enough to consistently get a power bonus in a clash either. Annihilate Heretics is his best skill for clashing. It inflicts a good amount of nails and also has the ability to heal Mersault on a hit, adding to his bulk even more. That being said, none of his skills are great for dealing damage, and the fact that 2 of them are Pierce also makes him less useful overall. He also loses points for being the only N-Corp ID that doesn't have a Lust skill, making him lose a little more since almost every N-Corp passive activates with Lust. He also doesn't perfectly fuel any of his ego at time of recording, which definitely hurts him more. Next up, we have what is in my opinion the strongest ID in the entire game, the one who grips Faust. She's an excellent damage dealer and has the strongest supporting effects of any ID in the game. If you've watched the other guides so far, you've heard me talk about her passives. Granting 15 SP during Lust Resonance is simply fantastic, and it even grants the affected units Fanatic if they're members of N-Corp. This is the most reliable way to get your SP up early in any team who is capable of using 4 Lust skills on turn 1. Her skill 1 is the last of the skills that use the N-Corp template, and is the most reliable one at inflicting nails. It also deals a very small amount of SP damage on winning a clash, which is usually helpful. In fact, her defense skill also does this on a successful evasion, so she has multiple methods of reducing enemy sanity. The gripping is her defining skill, being able to inflict a decent amount of nails, paralysis, and the unique status effect Gaze that is exclusive to her. Gaze increases the amount of pierce and blunt damage taken by 20%, which is already really useful for dealing damage, but if an ally kills an enemy who's affected by Gaze, they gain 10 SP and also gain Fanatic if they were from N-Corp. This is also the best damage dealing skill that Faust has, and her best skill for clashing. It is one of the strongest single skills in the entire game. Lastly, we have Execution. This skill can inflict 4 nails by itself, and the last coin even deals 50% more damage if the target has 5+ nails, which is really easy to activate. The main selling point of this skill is that if it kills an enemy, all allies gain 10 SP and deal 10% more pierce and blunt damage for the rest of the turn. Her skill 2 is almost always more reliable in basically any situation, but using this skill to kill an enemy is never a bad idea. This Faust ID is very good at fueling her own Hex Nail due to her first skill being Envy, and it's also thematically appropriate. Hex Nail is a very powerful ego for a fast character like Faust, inflicting large amounts of pierce and envy fragility. The fact that it inflicts curse is mostly just icing, causing the target enemy to be slightly weaker in a random area for the next 3 turns. After using it, Faust will also deal much more damage when she has a status condition, and while that usually isn't something you'd want, there are some fights where negative statuses are unavoidable, so it's a strong passive to increase your DPS. Alright, finally, we have the one who shall grip Sinclair. He's notable for that. Before talking about any of his skills specifically, all of his skills use negative coins, meaning flipping heads is a bad thing. All of his skills reduce his sanity when used, and his passive makes him gain less sanity from getting kills and winning clashes. Needless to say, you might want some way of giving him SP when he starts reaching the negative 30s range. Thankfully, he has this built into his kit. His defense skill will grant him 5 to 10 SP on combat start, so you can buffer corrosion if you needed to in most situations. It's also the only block skill which is a Sin affinity, which would be useful if the affinity was anything other than Pride. So as mentioned before, Sinclair's damage potential is absurdly high. That being said, Coerced Judgment is not a particularly strong damage dealing skill. It's important because it allows Sinclair to give himself Fanatic, which will up the damage of his other skills. Amoral Enactment is just crazy for dealing damage. Being able to roll 16 4 times in a row will put a significant dent into any enemy, even if they resist blunt damage. This skill also inflicts a lot of burn, which doesn't really matter when compared to the damage the skill already does, but when enemies have 2000 plus HP, passive damage is always really helpful. In most fights, however, this skill will just kill any enemy as long as it flips tails. Self-destructive Purge is frankly absurd. Due to how negative coin skills work, this skill's minimum roll in a clash ends up being 18, though that only comes after losing 2 coins, which doesn't normally happen. The amount of damage this skill dealt was already crazy before its damage bonuses against robots and while he is fanatic, but the second hit also deals massive stagger damage, so if it somehow managed to not stagger with the damage dealt, it will usually do so after the hit anyways. The last coin has some effects on it, but killing with this coin is inconsistent since the enemy will usually die to the first two, not that you would need blunt power up with these skills, and inflicting burn when the enemy has bleed is incredibly niche, though pretty likely in a bleed setup. And all of this would be enough to send this ID into high S tier, but he also feels his own impending day. With how negative coin IDs work, you're actually going to be using the corroded version of this skill more often. Failing a kill in this case will give you 10 bleed and 3 attack power up. This really sucks if you're fighting enemies with bleed count infliction, but otherwise, you have more than enough HP to trade 10 HP for +3 roll power for a turn. The other major benefit is that whenever Sinclair kills an enemy with one of his skills, you generate an additional 5 resources that match the skill's affinity, which is incredibly good for longer fights and activating your support passives. And if you ever use the Awakened version of this skill, getting a kill will give him attack power up and also heal the party, which is never a bad thing. I didn't mention his support passive? It's like a small blunt damage boost. The most common sin affinities in N-Corp are Lust, with 5 out of 6 identities being able to generate it, and Wrath and Pride both are found on 4 out of 6 of the identities. It really isn't worth going over all the ideas this can fuel, since all the ones I've already gone over are the ones you'd be likely to fuel here, but there are a few specific outliers that we should go over. The first one is Red Eyes Open, which is very easily fueled by the sin affinities provided by N-Corp. It's a powerful AoE attack, and Ryoshu even has an ID that fuels it really well, being her Chef de Cuisine ID. Faust's Fluid Sac is the strongest support ego in the game, in addition to it being able to hit 5 slots at once. It deals heavy damage in addition to healing HP and SP party-wide, making it a must-run in any team that features any Faust, since all of her IDs actually fuel it very well. Heathcliff's Telepole is another strong AoE ego, and has the funny ability to roll over 50 with its corroded variant. It helps Heathcliff out a lot in the overall damage department, and even gives him charge to activate the passive he gains from AEDD if you wanted to activate it. Usually you will be sticking to Body Sack though. Don Quixote's Telepole is also fueled very well by this faction. If you wanted to use them alongside W Corp Don Quixote, you very easily could in order to make it easier to gain enough charge to use Rip Space regularly, plus the attack itself deals good damage too. You can also very easily fuel Don Quixote's Fluid Sac, which is significant if you're running Don Quixote's N-Corp ID in a Tremor composition. It deals very heavy HP and SP damage on top of Bursting Tremor, and gives passive sanity damage to enemies every turn. It would be a lot stronger if Don's NID had a Gloom skill, but it's by no means a bad option. There's nothing really stopping you from throwing together 5 of the N-Corp IDs and calling it a team, because they do all have decent synergy with each other's egos. However, I'm going to take the opportunity to showcase a team that is unbeatable at inflicting bleed count instead. The N-Corp IDs that I brought are Faust, Rhodia, and Sinclair, since they deal the best damage out of all of them, and Faust and Rhodia also inflict good amounts of bleed. Plus, Rhodia gets Fanatic relatively frequently thanks to Faust's passive, making her clashing strength more reliable. The first other ID I decided to add was R-Corp 4th Pack Rhino Meersalt for 2 reasons. The first was that it had the perfect sin affinities to make using Fluid Sac easier, meaning he helps Faust out quite a lot. The other reason is that there is no other character who is better at inflicting straight bleed count with their skills. One big thing to mention here is that skills that inflict bleed count will have the ability to inflict bleed as well if the passives of Kurikumo Clan Ryoshu or Honglu are activated, meaning that Meersalt himself can consistently inflict large amounts of bleed even though he has no skills to directly inflict it. I ended up only using Kurikumo Honglu's passive for this myself, but you can use both if you want. I couldn't use both myself because my last team member was Chef de Cuisine Ryoshu. As mentioned before, teams involving N-Corp are very good at fueling Red Eyes Open, meaning she was an easy inclusion since she also has a Lust skill. On top of dealing heavy bleed damage by herself, she also inflicts bleed and bleed count and is capable of easily healing her allies when she gets a kill. This healing is amplified through the support passive of Sous Chef Gregor, which also grants passive healing every turn. These two on top of Fluid Sac make this team incredibly bulky on top of being able to deal very heavy damage. Not only that, but you also feel Forest for the Flames, which will help increase Ryoshu's overall damage significantly. There aren't many other support passives of note, since Otis and Yisang don't have very good support passives currently. If your team generates Sloth at all, you can increase the damage dealt to low SP enemies by a good amount with base Otis' support passive, and since these IDs all have a lot of coins, Liu Gregor's support passive can up your damage output by quite a bit as well. I brought Don in order to up Sinclair's damage, and Heath in order to inflict more nails, but there really isn't anything complicated about those. There are passives that you will not want to bring. Specifically, Yisang's base support passive is detrimental since it will always be increasing Sinclair's sanity to a point where it makes it so that Sinclair's coin flips are almost always heads, which isn't useful for his ID. I guess this team's big weakness is being unable to fuel any of Mersault's ego. This can be bypassed if you bring an ID that generates Sloth, allowing you to use Chains of Others, Screw Loose Wallop, and even Pursuance. The big thing to remember with this team setup is that all units need a Lust skill of some kind in order to activate Faust passive. And that's about all I have to say about Limbus Company's N-Corp Nagel Hammer IDs. I hope you found this little overview helpful and encourage you to play around with these IDs, and I'm curious to see what other strategies you all can come up with involving these IDs, so feel free to comment down below if there's a synergy that you found or a strategy involving them that works well for you. Also consider liking the video and subscribing as it helps me out a lot. This video took me a long time to make and I'd appreciate some support on it. I am recording this at 2 AM. I hope you have a great rest of your day and I hope to see you back for the next video. Bye bye!